In this video, we are going to learn about something called custom hooks, which will allow us to modularize our code. So in the last video, we learned how to talk to the Open Trivia API from our quiz game so that when we went to the quiz game in our application, it dynamically pulled in a set of questions that we could play through in the quiz game. And every time we reload this, it gets a new set of questions that it loads into our application. This was awesome. We were able to do something new and talk to a server, but it had this downside that we made our quiz page this monolithic component that did a whole lot of stuff, and it's really hard to tell at a glance what this component does. It's not terribly modular. So we can see that it has some state here that it stores, and it has this effect that goes off and talks to our Trivia API, gets the results, does some error handling, does some decoding of the results, and it is also responsible for the conditional logic down here of whether to display a loading spinner, an error message, or our actual game. It would be much better if we could split this up, and there are different levels of modularization that we could kind of apply here, but at least in broad strokes, we have two things going on. We have a component that's responsible for doing conditional rendering of an asynchronous action, so it's displaying a spinner, an error message, or the game. And we have a bit of logic here, all this stuff, that is talking to an API that really has nothing to do with our rendering logic. And so we can actually split these two things apart and have a custom hook that takes care of this fetching for us. And then our component can just be responsible for this view logic of determining what shows up on the page. So I've got the hooks documentation page open here. You can find it if you go to the docs under the hooks section, building your own hooks. And in React land, building your own hook is as simple as creating an external function, and it allows for some powerful composition. It allows you to take your logic, break it down into parts, and then compose them together in a functional approach. So it's worth taking a second and sort of like looking at the example that they've got here and walking through it. I recommend taking your time and reading through this. I'm going to go pretty quickly through it, but we'll get a high-level preview of what's going on here. So in the React docs, they have this component here that displays a friend status in a social media application, and it stores whether or not that friend is online. And then down here, it renders loading, online, or offline. To get the state working here, there's also this effect that is talking to some fictional API and asking for whether the friend is online, given their ID. And when that status changes, this function runs. So basically, this is hooking up the state here to an external service, to an API, and sort of syncing the state. And then down here, this is the unsubscribe to let the component unsubscribe from this handle status change whenever a new effect is run, or when the component is unmounted. So this is a similar situation to what we've got. We have this rendering logic here of determining what to show on the page, and we have this communication with the backend logic here that we can actually split apart using custom hooks. And this becomes really important, especially when you need to do this logic across multiple components. Maybe you have your friends list that is displaying all of this, and if you click on someone's page and you look at their page in your application, you also need to display this information. If you don't use custom hooks, you're going to have to sort of replicate this logic in multiple places. But if we do use custom hooks and we extract this from our component, we can reuse this stateful logic across multiple components. So that's kind of what they're explaining here, is that they're showing, hey, this component has the friend status here, and this other component has that same logic, this friend list item. And so you can extract this logic into a custom hook And a custom hook is just a function that starts with the word use and a lowercase use and uses some of the React hooks. So the state hook, the effect hook, any of the other hooks that we haven't covered yet, which you can check out over here. So it's just a function, uses this naming convention, and uses React hooks. And you can see that what it's doing is just the logic associated with talking to the backend chat API. So it has the state for whether or not the user's online. It has the effect that runs to subscribe to the backend API and update the state. And it returns whether or not the user is online. So this doesn't care at all about how you render things. It is just purely serving you up some information from that backend about whether a user is online. So there's no JSX here. But as soon as you create this function, you can bring it into your use friend status. And then, actually, here it is. This is the snippet where they import it. So here you can now use that hook that you've created, and your rendering logic is really simple. You can at a glance see that this is going to display loading, online, or offline. And because this is some logic that you're reusing in multiple places, we can use it in that friend status and the friend list component here. So you can see is online being brought into both of those places. So none of the logic has changed here. It's just how we're structuring things so that we can split up responsibilities so that our rendering logic can be separated from this stateful backend communication logic. So I definitely recommend checking this out. There's some more information inside of here, but this is going to be one of our primary strategies for taking these big components that have stateful logic in them and pulling out some of that logic into a custom hook that we can reuse. And if we look at what we've got here, basically we are going to take all of this out of our component so that our quiz page just is about rendering the loading spinner error message game, and this information comes from our custom hook. Okay, so to work on this, I'm using the files from the previous video where we set this up. There are no additional changes in here from that, so just use the previous version that you were building along with me. And what we're going to do is in our quiz folder, create a new folder here for hooks. And I'm going to create a new file in here that's called useGetTriviaData.js. And like we saw in the docs, a hook should by convention be named with a lowercase use, followed by the name of whatever your, or followed by a description of what your hook does. So this gets the trivia data from that trivia API. And then we want to export this use get trivia data. Whoops. So we've got our boilerplate here, and we can grab our fetch logic from our quiz page here. And paste it into this function. And we're going to have to fix up some of the imports. So like here, use get trivia, I'm using state. So I'm going to hit Control space to bring up the autocompletes here and pick the one that will bring in use state. If your VS Code is not doing this, then just make sure that you're importing these up at the top. And then we're also going to need the HTML entities library. Unfortunately, I have found that this one, for some reason, doesn't get detected. So let's import HE from HE. And now we should have all of those compile errors fixed. So we're basically creating a function that just is responsible for managing this state here, the loading, error message, data, and using the effect to go ahead and kick off all of our logic where we fetch the thing, check whether there are any errors and throw those errors, decode the final results, store them into our state, or store an error into our state. And then what we need to do after this whole effect here, so I'm just going to collapse this so it's easier to see, is our hook needs to return something so that our quiz page can actually get access to this data. So a hook, it can return anything you want. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. Like I could just return quiz fetch. I could return this object that has is loading error message data. I could return, if I wanted to, a array or a tuple with the quiz fetch and then the setter if we ever needed someone else to be able to set that state that's inside of this hook. So this bit is part of you defining how this hook is used. So a hook will generally get some input and then return some output. We'll get back to adding some input, but let's get this hook up and running before we start refactoring it. It is common, if we look back at our quiz page here, the way that React hooks work, it is common for them to return an array that we destructure. So we're pulling out the first element into this variable and the second element into this variable. And the reason why that's popular in the sort of React library is because then it lets you use state and pull out those variables into whatever you want. It's just based on where they are in the array that gets returned from use state. So we will often use that same paradigm here. So we will, let's grab our is loading error message and data from our quiz fetch. Remember that this is an object, so we are using object destructuring to pull those out into local variables, and then to return them we can put them into an array So now anyone that is using this hook gets these three pieces of information back as an array and can destructure them and name them whatever the consumer wants to name them. So what we can do with this hook is head back to our quiz page and delete all of this. And I'm going to create an empty array here and set it equal to get use trivia. And then I'm hitting Control Space to pop up my IntelliSense completions, which auto completed the import. And then if I start, let's grab those variables, is loading error message data. And rerun our application. So I already had my server running here. So just make sure that you're npm running the start script. And now every time it loads, it's still doing the same logic. I can see the fetching console log from our hook still running. But this is happening not inside of our quiz page anymore, but inside of this custom hook that we've created. And just to drive the point home about these custom hooks, the thing that we're exporting here with the array, I don't have to name it is loading error message data. If I wanted to, I could call the third parameter trivia data. And instead of error message, I could call this error. And the whole thing works just the same. So the array spread and the array destructuring that we're doing here is purely so that it makes it easy to bring in a hook, get multiple pieces of information, and pull them out into local variables that have their own name. So let's add some of that as comments here. we are array destructuring to create local variables with our own names. And then if we go back to our hook, we can say hooks can return anything they want, but it is common to return an array so that the consumer can destructure multiple pieces of data into local variables. Whoops. Oh, that is not being recognized as a correctly spelled word. So since we now have a custom hook, let's improve it. So right now, this hook is always going to be requesting 5 questions that are multiple choice. And if we pull up our Trivia API here in the browser, whoops, copied too much. Here we go. Okay, one more time. It is without the API at the end because the API is actually requesting something from the API, and opentdb.com is actually the documentation. So if we check out the API here, we can see that when we generate a URL, these settings are set in what's called the query string. So if we change the type to multiple choice, hit generate, we can see the type is added here to filter the results. And if we wanted only easy questions that are multiple choice and generate, we would get something here that tacks all of those on into the URL with ampersands between them to join all those parameters. So we'll make a query that looks something like this, but we want the amount and difficulty to be parameters. Or in terms of our hook here, we want to say that the user can specify the amount and the difficulty. And we will choose some sensible default here of 10 questions, and the difficulty we will say is an empty string. So let's just focus on the amount, and we'll come back to the difficulty because there's an added wrinkle with the difficulty. The amount, as soon as we declare that this is a parameter, instead of saying 5 here, what we can do is turn this into a template string and insert that variable directly in here. And then we want to make sure that our effect, which we were currently saying has no dependencies, and we had this note here that an empty array means that this effect only runs when the hook or the component is mounted. We now actually have a dependency. So I'm getting a little warning here from my linter that's telling me, hey, you used the variable amount inside of this effect. You probably should rerun your effect anytime that variable changes. So now our effect will run when the component is mounted, and will also run anytime this amount changes. So if we come back here, we can decide to pass in some number of questions. Let's say we want 8, and go back to our application and see that 8 questions have loaded from the API. And if we want a long quiz, we could ask for 20 questions. And now when this refetches, it's getting 20 questions from the API. Let's set this back down to 5. We're getting 5 questions. Looks good. So now let's think about that difficulty setting. So the added wrinkle here is that a difficulty of any means that you actually don't pass anything in here for the difficulty setting. So it's not that you're saying like difficulty equals empty string. You are omitting the difficulty when you want any difficulty. Same thing for any type. So to have this parameter for our hook work, we want to, if they have given us a string, we should put that into the URL. If they haven't, then we don't put anything into the URL here. So we could do something like if difficulty is equal to an empty string, here's our URL. Otherwise, we'll create the URL with the difficulty in there. But there is something built into the browser that will help here. So let's undo this. And let's create an instance of the URL search params. And this is a, well, I guess relatively new feature in JavaScript, but it is supported in modern browsers. So if we check out the docs for this, we just go ahead and flip back to the browser, search for URL search params, and go to MDN. This is a interface that allows you to work with the query part of the URL. So that is the part after the question mark here. And it has methods for creating a new one, for adding things to that query, for deleting things, for looping over everything that's in there, for checking whether there's stuff in there. So this is a really useful way to build up query strings or parse query strings from a URL. And you can kind of see them doing that here. Like they made a fake query string, parsed it here, and we're able to loop over and ask whether there are certain things inside of that search params. So a couple ways that you can use this. One, if we go to the constructor, we can see that there are a few ways that you can construct it. You can pass in a string. You can pass in an array of arrays that feature the name of the parameter and the value of the parameter, or you can pass in an object with the name of the parameter and the value of the parameter. And then you can also use the append method here to add things where you pass in the name and the value. So I'm going to combine both of those in our example here. We know that we always need to set the amount. So I'm going to pass that in using the object form where here's the name that goes into the query string and here's the value that goes into the query string. And then if difficulty is not equal to an empty string, then I am going to append to that search parameter object. I'm going to append difficulty and the actual value that the user has supplied to us. And then when we're constructing our URL, we don't actually need to pass any of this stuff in. We just need our endpoint, a question mark, and then we can ask for the parameter to convert itself to a string using one of the methods that that search parameters object has. So let's get rid of that console log, and then for future reference, I am going to drop this in here, because this is a really handy part of JavaScript. So now this should work. Let's actually console log it so that we can see what is being fetched. Right now, we are not specifying a difficulty, so we're getting amount 10 after the API. That's not right. I want it to be amount 5. Because obviously I was not paying close attention. So I want to use the amount variable here. So we're saying the key is equal to whatever the amount variable is. And when you have an object where you're passing in a variable that is the same name as the key, you can actually just omit this and just say amount. Okay, there we go. So we're seeing amount 5. And if I go back here and pass in easy, we're seeing difficulty equals easy being added to our query string, and the object is taking care of joining these things together with the ampersand and formatting them so it is the key equals the value, key equals the value. And we can see that everything that's being pulled here is an easy question. Oh, and because I can't think on the fly here, I'm going to get some of these wrong, even though we can see that they're all easy. It would make sense for us maybe also to add a type parameter here to our query. So let's say that the type is always multiple, which is what we would see if we played around with the API. This is what we were passing in originally in our string. So now we're always specifying the amount, always specifying the type is multiple, and we're conditionally adding that difficulty in there. So now we can see our API call being printed out here. 5, multiple, easy. So this is looking good. We have basically created a new hook here that has some inputs that determine its call to the API, and it has some outputs here, the loading information, the error message, the data, and we're able to use this in our quiz page to make requests of that API without needing to know any of the implementation details here. We just know that because this is a hook, it's always going to stay in sync, and we'll always have the latest information about whether it's loading, its error, or the data that it returns back to us. So we can delete some of these imports here. And if we flip back, I just want to fix this. Because I added another parameter, I need to make sure that my effect runs anytime those two things change. Give this a save. And if you were to think about changing this interface, what you could do is have an input that controls these things that's on the page. So the user can configure how many questions they want, and then hit play before all of this stuff runs. Okay, last thing that I want to do is actually break this down a little bit further. So this is great. We've made a big improvement of creating a custom hook here, but we have a lot that's going on here that we can break apart. So one easy piece to break apart is this decoding. We can just create a utility function that does this logic. So let's call it like decode trivia data. And we'll take in the results, decode it, and return the decoded results. So now this hook doesn't need to know about how that's implemented. Instead of setting the data here directly to the results, it's just going to go ahead and before it drops it into the state, decode it. And this should still work in our browser. Yep, looking good. So to just make the point clear, this is just a utility function. This is not another custom hook. This is a custom hook because it uses the React hooks, the state hook here and the effect hook. So this is just a utility function. And this is our first hook. And if we wanted, we can sort of modularize some more pieces here. We could actually pull this out of our effect. So this fetching of a URL, it might be something that we'll do in multiple places. So it might be smart for us to think about pulling this logic out into a common function. So I could create an asynchronous function here that fetches JSON from a URL. which basically does this. And then returns the JSON. So this is another utility function, but this time an async one. And then instead of what we had before, we can just say our JSON is equal to fetch JSON from this URL. And whoops, looks like I made a mistake here. Let's check out what the error was. Telling me that I can't map at the decode trivia data stage. So I have made a mistake here before we get to this line of code. Ah, yes. Okay. Because this is an asynchronous function that has asynchronous logic, this is a function that returns a promise. It returns a promise that eventually returns JSON or resolves to JSON. So when I use it here, I need to make sure that I await that fetch JSON. So this is giving me a promise. If I await it, I actually get the JSON. And if this throws an error, then we end up catching that error. Okay, and we're back to having our application working. So these things, these are just utilities. These help us in just the basic programming sense modularize our code, and some of them would be useful to move out of this file and maybe take up to our common utils folder so that it is easy for us in the future if we decide we want to fetch some JSON to go ahead and fetch it without having to remember that you have to fetch and then convert the response to JSON. And this one is more specific to this file, so maybe we won't move this out of the file. This is just decoding the trivia results that we get back from the API. Okay, so wrapping this up, we created our first hook, and a hook is just a function that takes in some parameters. Those are up to you, returns something, and uses the React hooks somewhere in it. So in this case, we used state and effect. It could also be that your hook uses someone else's code that uses the React lifecycle in them. That would still turn your function into a hook. And then once we have created a hook, it helps us offload some of our, in this case, stateful logic out of this view component so that when we glance at this component, we can see like, ah, cool, it gets the trivia data and then conditionally loads a spinner, an error message, or the game. We will definitely be building more hooks as we go, and that's why I have created this as a hooks folder instead of just a single file, because you can imagine when we start getting into Firebase in the next video and the next few videos, we will need to both be able to get data from the database, we will need to be able to put new data in the database, we'll need to be able to delete data from the database, and those types of things we can actually wrap up in reusable hooks, rather than having to implement all of the logic directly in our components here. So that's all I got for you in this video. I'll see you in the next one.